A vital witness vanished, minutes before signing the deal of a lifetime. Welcome to Sayers and Secrets. I am your host, Luis Ordóñez. Let me know in the comments, where are you joining this mystery from? Your presence sharpens every twist and turn. Let's dive in. I'll admit it wasn't the most dramatic entrance ever made through Nero Wolfe's front door. No bloodstains on the collar, no trembling fingers holding a revolver wrapped in a handkerchief, no screams from the stoop. Just a modest, olive-colored man in a suit 2 shades lighter than his shoes, and a smile so polished I could practically see my own reflection in it. Fritz had buzzed me on the phone upstairs to say a visitor was requesting a moment, just a moment, Mr. Goodwin, with Mr. Wolfe. That phrase alone should have guaranteed the man a spot on Wolfe's blacklist for life. Wolfe does not give moments. He distributes fragments of his day the way a Swiss banker parts with diamonds, reluctantly and at interest. When I opened the door to the office, our guest stood exactly where Fritz had left him, by the globe, one foot resting slightly behind, the other as if he were prepared to pivot and make a break for it. He wasn't tall, but he had that confident, exacting posture that made you guess he'd made plenty of money from not telling the truth. "Mr. Wolfe," I said, because Wolfe was already seated behind his desk, handling a volume on rare orchids, like it might wilt from the wrong sentence. "This is Mr. Ralph Mornay," the man said, stepping forward with his hand out. Wolfe didn't look up. He muttered something that might have been a greeting, or might have been a botanical classification. "Mr. Mornay," I said, shaking his hand for us both, "let's pretend you said something very compelling to Fritz to get in here. What was it?" "I have reason to believe a man has disappeared," Mornay said, setting a manila envelope on the edge of Wolfe's desk. "A man I was scheduled to meet this morning. He is, or was, the key witness to a contract negotiation involving $36 million in potential mergers." That got Wolfe's attention. He didn't glance at the envelope, but he did close his book. That's the equivalent of another man standing up and shouting, "I don't find the subject of mergers palatable," Wolfe said, and the phrase potential renders the value meaningless. "Then let me try this." Mornay dropped his smile and gave me a look that suggested we'd just skipped foreplay. "The man who vanished is a junior partner with a reputation for discretion and an unfortunate tendency toward anxiety. His name is Martin Delham. Yesterday he told me over lunch that he was considering backing out of a sworn statement. This morning he didn't show up. And this," he tapped the envelope, "contains a photocopy of a contract with a missing witness signature and several discreet annotations I didn't make." I picked up the envelope, turned it in my hands and raised my brow. "And what exactly do you expect Mr. Wolfe to do? Locate the missing signature, or the man who didn't sign it?" "I expect Mr. Wolfe to tell me whether Martin Delham disappeared on his own, or was helped along." Now it's worth noting that Wolfe has an allergic reaction to anything resembling corporate politics. His mind belongs to order, not committees. But what this man had said, the missing witness, the hesitations, the timing, it didn't smell of boardrooms and quarterly reports. It smelled personal, which is probably why Wolfe didn't tell him to get lost immediately. "You are not a relative," Wolfe said. "No, not a friend, not in the sense you mean." Wolfe sighed. "Then why are you here?" Mornay's smile returned, smaller this time. "Because when someone begins unraveling from fear, they often confide in the wrong people. Martin confided in me, and now he's missing. I need to know whether it's a coincidence or a consequence. Wolfe steepled his fingers and stared at the envelope like it had insulted his orchids. Phooey. Coincidence is the alibi of the... Inattentive. That was as good as a nibble. I presume you're well compensated in your line of work, Mr. Mornay, Wolfe added. I'm willing to be equally generous here. I'm sure you are. Wolfe finally looked at me. Archie. Take Mr. Mornay's details, then telephone Mr. Kramer and inquire discreetly whether a Martin Delham has turned up in a morgue, a jail cell, or the trunk of an abandoned car. Discreetly, I repeated. So only 3 boroughs. Mornay adjusted his cufflinks. For what it's worth, I've already tried the jails and the hospitals. There's no record. That, Wolfe said, settling back into his chair, is almost interesting. Archie, see him out. Then make those calls. I escorted Mornay to the door, and as we stepped into the hall, he turned and asked, Is he always like that? Only when he's intrigued, I said. Otherwise, he's much worse. I shut the door behind him and returned to the office. Wolfe had already reopened his orchid book, but I noticed his eyes weren't moving. That meant the wheels were. You think the man's dead? I asked. No. Wolfe didn't look up. I think the man is frightened, and fear, Archie, makes men vanish better than violence. I picked up the receiver and dialed. And sometimes, I said, it makes them lie. Wolfe grunted. That was agreement. The game had begun, and this one, if I knew Wolfe, wasn't going to end with just a signature. It's a rare occasion when Nero Wolfe allows his personal sanctum, the brownstone at West 35th Street, to be soiled by more than one outsider in the span of a week, let alone 2 in the same day. But by mid-afternoon, after I had confirmed, through my usual sources, that Martin Delham wasn't lying low in a cell, or stretched out in a morgue drawer, the front bell rang again. And Fritz, who's got the ears of a Doberman and the hospitality instincts of a maitre d' at the Ritz, gave me the look that meant trouble, coat optional. I swung the front door open and found a woman standing there who could have made headlines just by declining comment. Tall, crisp, and sharp as a legal clause, with a coat so expertly tailored it probably came with its own accountant. Her eyes, grey and precise, looked me over like she'd just drafted a contract in her head and filed me under non-essential personnel. I'm looking for Mr. Wolfe, she said. Then you're halfway there, I told her. Name? Elena. Voss, I believe you were speaking with Ralph Mornay earlier today. He and I are professionally acquainted. And is this a social follow-up, or are we escalating to suddenly concerned parties? Something in between, she said, stepping forward. May I? It wasn't a question, and before I could answer, she was inside, already, brushing invisible lint from her sleeve like she was allergic to mahogany paneling. I followed her into the office, where Wolfe had just set down a glass of beer. He didn't look pleased. Wolfe never looks pleased when anyone enters his office uninvited, but his expression suggested someone had just insulted his mother and trampled his zinnias in the same breath. This is Miss Elena Voss, I said, apparently not here to sell us anything. Mr. Wolfe, she said, nodding once. I believe you may have accepted a case earlier today concerning a man named Martin Delham. Belief is a presumption, Wolfe replied. State your business. I'm his attorney. That earned her a slow blink from Wolfe and a small one from me. I wasn't aware he required representation, Wolfe said. Neither was I until he contacted me yesterday evening in a state of alarm, she said, walking toward the desk but not sitting. He left a voicemail, rambling, disconnected, but it was clear he intended to withdraw from a contractual witness role involving the Mornay-Prescott merger. I whistled low. That's a $20 million egg to crack in a message. She looked at me briefly, then back to Wolfe. He never called back, and this morning he didn't arrive at our scheduled meeting. Wolfe leaned back in his chair and pressed his fingertips together, the same way a cat might arch its back when contemplating whether or not to pounce. You are concerned for his welfare. I'm concerned for his conscience, she said. That wasn't the answer I expected. Elaborate, Wolfe said. Martin is intelligent but impressionable. He was brought into the Prescott negotiations late in the process. His name was added as a witness only after some discrepancies in earlier drafts came to light. He began asking questions. Then he began hesitating. What kind of discrepancies? I asked. Changes to liability clauses, shifts in fiduciary oversight, enough to raise concern for someone who signs on the dotted line, but isn't high enough up the ladder to do so blindly. And yet, Wolfe said, he did not refuse, until perhaps now. Voss nodded once. And now he's gone. Do you suspect foul play? I asked. I suspect fear, she said, echoing Wolfe's earlier diagnosis, but whether it's external or self-inflicted, I can't say. I glanced at Wolfe. He hadn't moved except to tilt his head. That meant he was threading the needle between what he knew, what he didn't, and what he wanted to fish out of her next. Miss Voss, he said, what is your relationship to Mr. Mornay? Professional, she answered too quickly. Then, softening, she added, and occasionally personal. Wolfe closed his eyes for a moment, then opened them slowly. So you trust him? I trust that he acts in his own interest, and that our interests have, until now, overlapped. And now? That remains to be seen. There was a silence thick enough to cut, which Wolfe did by finally gesturing to the red chair across from him. Sit, if you please. Mr. Goodwin, bring me the envelope Mr. Mornay left. I retrieved it from the drawer. I'd stashed it in earlier, and handed it to Wolfe, who unfolded the documents with the sort of care he usually reserved for 18th-century French cookbooks. He read for 2 full minutes. No movement, no sound, but the occasional puff of breath through his nose. When he finished, he looked at Miss Voss. These annotations, were they in your firm's version? She leaned over to look. No, she said after a beat. Those are additions not in Martin's hand. I whistled again. And not in yours, I assume. I don't annotate by hand. Wolfe looked at me. Archie, call Saul Panzer. Have him begin a quiet but thorough check on Martin Delham, residences, known associates, transit patterns. Got it. Wolfe turned back to Voss. Miss Voss, you will inform no one of this visit. Not Mornay, not Prescott, and certainly not your managing partner. Am I clear? She smiled for the first time. Not friendly, but as if she'd just realized Wolfe wasn't a dinosaur after all, but one with teeth. Perfectly. She rose, straightened her coat, and gave Wolfe a parting nod. Thank you for your time. He didn't respond, and she left, escorted out by yours truly. I watched her disappear down the steps and into a car that probably cost more than my annual salary. When I came back in, Wolfe was still staring at the annotated contract like it had just confessed to larceny. So, I said, 2 visitors in one day. both unusually polished, both worried about our missing man, and neither telling us the whole story. "Indeed," Wolfe muttered, "which suggests that the truth is either embarrassing, criminal, or profitable, possibly all three." "And you're in," Wolfe snorted. "I am surrounded by the stench of corruption. Of course I'm in." He reached for the bell cord and summoned Fritz. "Lunch," he said, "something with truffles." It was his way of celebrating. We had a missing man, an altered contract, a compromised witness, and at least 2 beautiful liars already in play. The brownstone was disturbed, and that for Nero Wolfe was the only kind of entertainment worth enduring. The next morning, after Wolfe had consumed precisely 2 eggs, soft scrambled with chives, and I had consumed 3 cups of coffee that didn't need to apologize for their strength, the case started to grow legs. I don't mean it started sprinting. Wolfe wouldn't permit that kind of undignified activity under his roof. But it did begin to stand a little taller, take on shape, and reveal some contours that hinted at hidden weapons. Saul Panzer called at 10:22. That's earlier than usual for Saul, which either meant he hadn't slept or something in his preliminary dig had hit pay dirt. "Delham hasn't touched his bank account in 48 hours, Saul reported. "No hotel check-ins, no public transit logs since Monday. No calls from his cell phone. But, and here's the kicker, he booked a one-way train ticket to Philadelphia the night he called Elena Voss." "Did he board?" I asked. "No record. Ticket was paid in cash and never scanned at the gate. Slippery. Or someone wanted it to look that way." I thanked him and told him to keep digging on the Prescott firm and any mutual contacts between Voss, Mornay, and Delham. Wolfe, listening from his chair like a stone deity with a sinus condition, grunted when I relayed the summary. "That woman," he said, meaning Elena Voss, "did not volunteer that detail. Nope. She either doesn't know, which suggests a compartmentalized relationship, or she does know and chooses silence, which suggests strategic positioning." I made a note to avoid both her type and her wardrobe budget. "Want me to start collecting warm bodies?" Wolfe nodded, but only slightly. "Begin with the Prescott Group. Identify key personnel in the negotiation, those who stood to gain from Delham's signature, and those who stood to lose from its absence. I take it that includes Monday?" "Mr. Mornay may be the wick," Wolfe said, "but someone else struck the match." By noon, I had a list of 5 names worth batting around. I called them suspects to myself, but only because "people who lie for money" sounded too vague. The first was Dane Prescott, senior partner and heir to the Prescott Empire, which specialized in mergers, acquisitions, and sipping gin in Manhattan lounges while pretending to solve problems. He was listed on every contract draft and carried a reputation for charm that extended exactly as far as his need to impress you. The second, Greta Lang, corporate strategist and one-time Harvard professor, who'd crossed over to the dark side when she realized she could make more money in a month advising buyouts than in a year teaching ethics. Third, Chet Ralston, financial analyst, whose job description involved spreadsheets, equity models, and, according to rumor, providing strategic leaks to journalists on merger speculation. His presence on this list was earned by being the last known person to have lunch with Martin Delham 3 days ago. Fourth, Troy Maddox, Prescott's in-house counsel. The man who handled contracts, red lines, and reportedly had a temper so controlled it made nuclear containment seem casual. I had a theory about lawyers who never raise their voice. They usually did their screaming through clauses and footnotes. Fifth, naturally, was Ralph Mornay, our visitor from yesterday with the polished smile and the careful wording. As the acquiring party, Mornay had every reason to want Delham confident, compliant, and quiet. But as things stood, his presence at the brownstone now took on a second hue. I started making calls and appointments. Prescott's people were scattered like anxious chess pieces, some in their offices, some at brunches disguised as power meetings. I didn't bother calling in credentials. I just told them Nero Wolfe was conducting an inquiry into a matter concerning their firm and a missing associate. That got me 3 callbacks and 1 reluctant lunch meeting. I started with Greta Lang. She met me in a cafe that could have been imported from Paris if Paris charged double and served ironic espresso. Greta was all angles, high cheekbones, sharp hair, sharper voice. "Martin," she said, stirring sugar into her cup like it had personally offended her. "Yes, I know him. Timid, bright, easily rattled. He once revised a contract 6 times in one day because he overheard Prescott say something ambiguous about indemnity clauses. Sounds conscientious. Sounds spineless," she countered. "But that's what Prescott liked about him. Martin could be bent without breaking." I raised an eyebrow. "But he did break." She shrugged. "If he's missing, it's because he got spooked. Not surprising. He was beginning to think his signature made him legally culpable." "And did it?" Greta leaned forward. "That depends. Did anyone tell him about the quiet amendment Troy Maddox slid into draft version 5? I blinked. "Which amendment?" She smiled. "Exactly." I thanked her, paid the bill, and jotted a mental note to ask Saul for that specific draft. By the time I was back in the cab, Maddox was moving up the list. I met with Chet Ralston next. His office was as tidy as a prison cell and twice as beige. He wore a tie patterned with tiny graphs and looked like he hadn't exhaled fully since 2018. Martin was nervous, he told me. Said he'd been approached by someone who wanted him to delay his signature. Who? He didn't say, but I assumed it was Elena Voss. Why? Chet hesitated. Because she's very careful about paper trails, and she didn't want him on the record until she'd reviewed every dotted I and crossed T. She your type? Chet flushed. That's not relevant. Which told me it absolutely was. Last stop, Dane Prescott. The man himself. He greeted me in a glass office with a view so wide you could have used it to chart enemy movements. He didn't offer a seat. That was fine. I didn't offer any patience either. I don't appreciate investigators snooping through my stuff, he said, adjusting his cufflink as though it held executive authority, especially ones hired without due process. Then you'll love this, I said. Martin Delham's vanished, and it's possible someone in your firm made that easier. He didn't blink. Martin's a minor player. He probably got cold feet and went camping. You're wasting your time. I smiled. If I'm wasting my time, you're wasting your best chance at controlling the story. That earned me a long look. Then, with the quiet condescension of a man used to being obeyed by elevators and waiters, he said, You have 5 minutes. I took 7. When I returned to the brownstone that evening, Wolfe was in the plant room. I gave Fritz the rundown, then went in with a full report. 5 suspects, I said, and 1 contract that got more interesting with each signature. We've got amended clauses, quiet interference, and at least 1 lawyer who may have rewritten the whole thing without blinking. Wolfe closed his eyes. Miss Lang suggested the amendment. She hinted. Maddox likely wrote it. And Voss? Played it straight, but maybe deeper in than she lets on. She and Mornay are a matched pair. Slick, calculating, and possibly working different sides of the same street. Wolfe grunted. The question is not who. Benefits it is who panicked. I nodded. Delham. No, Wolfe said, his eyes still closed. Someone else panicked first. That's what made Delham disappear. And that, I realized, was the hinge of it. Someone made Martin run, and Wolfe intended to find out who and why, without ever rising from his chair. By Thursday morning, Wolfe had finished his breakfast and his third beer, and I had finished listening to him scowl at the newspaper. I say listen, because Wolfe doesn't complain about the world like you or me. He emotes through breath, eyebrow shifts, and the precise way he turns a page, as if trying to snap the editor's neck through the print. Archie, he said, at last, you will revisit Miss Voss, begin with civility, end with pressure. What's the middle part? I asked. Listening, he replied grimly, preferably with attention, so I put on my best listening tie, navy blue, no pattern, and headed downtown to the law offices of Fenton, Voss and Bright. The reception area smelled like leather and litigation. A junior in a suit, 2 sizes too expensive for his age, greeted me like I was interrupting a merger, but I flashed enough wolfness to get buzzed through. Elena Voss stood when I entered her office. I appreciated the gesture, even if her smile hadn't received the memo. Her desk was organized with military precision, and there was a single framed photograph. A dog, not a person. That told me more about her than any resume could. You don't waste time, she said. Time is only wasted when it's spent without result, I replied, borrowing one of Wolfe's better lines. You said Martin contacted you. Left? A voicemail and then disappeared. I'd like to hear that message. She didn't move. That's confidential, she said. Martin Delham is a missing person, I countered. Potentially manipulated, possibly coerced, and very likely afraid. His message could help find him. She considered that. Then she opened a drawer, pulled out a phone, tapped a few times, and handed it to me. The voice was thin, reedy, and rushed. Definitely Martin. He was rambling about revisions, something being pushed through too fast, and they said I wouldn't have to, but now it's in the contract again. Troy said he'd handle it, but Greta's warning me, and now I don't know. Then it cut out. Charming, I said. Was that the whole thing? She nodded. He sounded worse in person. I gave her a look. And yet you let him walk out the door. I tried to follow up. He wouldn't answer. I figured he needed space. Martin's always been reactive. Reactive enough to run? Reactive enough to believe someone would destroy him over a paragraph. I thanked her and left. On my way down, I made a note. Troy Maddox's name just got underlined twice. Next, I went digging for Chet Ralston. I hadn't pressed him too hard during our first encounter. He'd been jittery enough to set off a seismograph, but now I wanted more, especially about that last lunch with Martin. He met me at a diner just off Lexington, looking like he'd aged 5 years in 48 hours. No tie this time, just a creased shirt and the haunted eyes of someone whose loyalty was up for negotiation. I'm not sure what else I can say, he muttered over coffee. He was nervous. He kept checking his phone. Said he'd been warned. Warned by whom? He didn't say, but he was angry. Thought someone had looped him in too deep, and that was the phrase he used. Looped in. Yeah said his name was now associated with something bigger than he signed up for, and that if the Prescott deal fell through, someone would blame him. That aligned with Wolfe's theory. Martin hadn't panicked for no reason. He'd been made to, and someone in his orbit was playing a long game. I paid the bill and left Ralston staring into his mug like it owed him an apology. By late afternoon I was back in the brownstone with Wolfe, relaying everything over a late lunch of Cornish hens and mushroom risotto. Wolfe ate like he was preparing for an argument, methodically and in silence. When I finished, he wiped his mouth and said, "Mr. Maddox." "Yes?" "Find him." I called Prescott Group and was told Mr. Maddox was out of the office for the day, attending an off-site meeting. No location provided. I tried his cell. No answer. I tried again, this time with a voicemail that suggested Wolfe's patience was as finite as an unpaid invoice. No callback, which left me the one thing I dislike more than pressing charges: waiting. Instead, I turned my attention to Greta Lang. I hadn't spoken to her since our cafe chat, but something she'd said was rattling around in my head like a loose screw. Martin could be bent without breaking. I called her and offered a proposition. "Meet me," I said, "and help me understand what broke him." She hesitated, then agreed to a drink at a hotel bar where the lighting was soft enough to blur reputations. She arrived dressed in deep green with a look that could stop a conversation 2 tables over. "He called me," she said, sitting. "Martin, right after you visited me, he was panicked, said someone had gotten into his apartment." I blinked. "He told you this?" "He did. He said his laptop was moved, a folder was missing, and someone had left a printed version of the final contract with a sticky note that said, 'Consider your options.'" "Who would do that?" "That's why I'm here," she said, lowering her voice. "I think someone wanted to scare him off the record. Not just out of town, out of the contract, permanently. And you didn't go to the police." "I went to his apartment. I believed him. But by the time I got there, he was gone." "Did you see the note?" "No, but I saw the folder. Empty." This was a new level of the game, intimidation by suggestion. Wolfe was right. Fear was the accelerant here, and someone was dosing it out with precision. "Who benefits most if Martin disappears?" I asked her. She didn't answer immediately. Then, almost reluctantly, "Maddox. He drafted the final version. He knows where the bodies are buried, figuratively speaking." "Let's hope it stays that way," I muttered. By the time I got back to the brownstone, it was past 7. Fritz had set out dinner, and Wolfe was already in his chair reviewing the annotated contract again like it was a confession in disguise. I delivered the summary, detail by detail, the voicemail, the threats, the folder, the sticky note, Greta's admission. When I finished, Wolfe closed his eyes for a long moment. "The pressure point is narrow," he said, "but the push was deliberate. You think Maddox staged the scare. I think Mr. Maddox is accustomed to making problems disappear with pen and language. This time, he may have used fear. That's a dangerous transition." He paused, then opened his eyes. "Tomorrow, Archie, we summon them." "All of them?" "All of them." He reached for his beer. "The brownstone has been disturbed long enough. It's time to unsettle them in return." That was Wolfe's version of rolling up his sleeves, and tomorrow his office would become the arena. 1 chair for Wolfe, 1 for me, and 5 suspects. walked into a trap they wouldn't see until it was too late. The brownstone was quiet the next morning, but it wasn't peaceful. It was the kind of quiet that meant something had taken root, something waiting just beneath the surface, growing toward the light. Wolfe didn't say much during breakfast, which for him meant his brain was working overtime, and he hadn't yet decided whether or not he'd need to scold the entire city by dinner time. I, on the other hand, had made 3 phone calls before my second cup of coffee. By 9, all 5 of our key players had been invited, or instructed depending on their temperament, to appear at the brownstone that afternoon. Wolfe wasn't asking for cooperation. He was making a demand in velvet. But the day didn't wait for our schedule. Around 11, I was in the front room reviewing my notes when I heard Fritz call my name from the kitchen, just loud enough to register concern without committing to full alarm. "Mr. Goodwin," he said, holding out a small, unassuming object in his palm. "This was on the counter. Do you recognize it?" It was a silver fountain pen. Polished, expensive, not Fritz's, not mine, and Wolfe wouldn't use a fountain pen even if it signed his checks with truffle oil. "Where exactly did you find it?" "Near the tea tins," he said. "In the drawer I keep closed unless I'm preparing the afternoon tray." That stopped me. "Was it open when you found it?" "Yes," Fritz said, "and that is not usual." No, it wasn't. Fritz's idea of disorder is leaving a teaspoon unpolished. That drawer being open meant someone had accessed it, someone who didn't belong there. "Did anyone come through the kitchen yesterday?" "No one," he said, firmly. "Only Miss Voss, Mr. Mornay, and the others you brought through the office. None of them entered the kitchen." That narrowed it to one conclusion. Someone came back. I took the pen into Wolfe's office and laid it on the desk in front of him without a word. He regarded it like a foreign specimen. "You or Fritz?" "Neither. Fritz found it in the tea drawer, which last I checked was not open to the public." Wolfe's brows drew together. "So?" "Yes," I said. "So?" He didn't need to say what we were both thinking. Someone had returned to the brownstone without permission, and they hadn't come to chat. I checked the locks, no signs of forced entry. I checked the hall. Nothing on the security chain, and no neighbors had noticed a thing, which meant either one of our visitors from earlier had managed to get a key impression, or we'd been sloppy. Wolfe wasn't one to let a trespass slide. "Find out who carries a fountain pen," he said. "That narrows it down to 36 investment lawyers," I muttered. "Then narrow it further," Wolfe replied, closing his eyes. This was a message. "Think it's tied to the note Dellum found?" Wolfe didn't answer immediately. "No. That note was meant for fear. This is meant for provocation." He opened his eyes. "They want to know how close we are. They want to rattle me." "Well," I said, pocketing the pen, "they obviously haven't met you." That afternoon the chairs were arranged in the office the way Wolfe preferred when preparing a siege. One chair for him, of course, planted behind his desk like a general's throne. One for me, right flank, and 5 chairs angled for maximum exposure, facing him, not each other, because Wolfe believed in keeping adversaries from building alliances with their eyes. They began arriving shortly after 3. First was Ralph Mornay, looking polished, but a touch less confident than on his last visit. Next came Greta Lang, punctual to the minute, and carrying a leather folio like she expected to use it as a shield. Chet Ralston followed, pale and damp around the edges, and looking like he hadn't slept since the Reagan administration. Troy Maddox came forth, his expression unreadable but his suit freshly pressed, and his shoes shined with surgical precision. And finally, Elena Voss, calm, poised, and, when she noticed the others already seated, decidedly interested. Wolfe didn't rise, of course. He didn't even greet them. He waited until the last coat was removed and the last throat was cleared. Then he spoke. "You are here," he said, "because a man has disappeared." That got their attention. "Martin Delham," he continued, "a junior associate, a contract witness, a man of fragile conviction and inconvenient integrity. He is missing. Not because he fled, not because he was abducted, but because he was manipulated, pressured by at least one of you, and very likely more." There were shifting eyes. Wolfe noticed them all. "You will each speak," he said, "and you will each listen. Mr. Goodwin will record, and at the end of this process, I will know the name of the person who entered my home without invitation." That jolted them. "You were trespassed?" Maddox asked, arching a brow. "Yes," Wolfe said, "and the person left this." He gestured to the pen now resting on his desk. It gleamed under the lamp, innocent as a gun without prints. "Does it belong to anyone here?" No one spoke. Lang squinted at it. Mornay tilted his head. Voss remained still. Ralston looked confused. Maddox allowed himself a smirk. "You assume this was left to send a message?" "I assume nothing," Wolfe said. "I observe. And I have observed enough to know when pressure shifts into provocation." "You're accusing one of us?" Lang asked. "No," Wolfe said. "I am concluding one of you is involved. Accusation implies uncertainty, silence." "Now," Wolfe said, "we will discuss the sequence of events that led to Delham's decision to withdraw, his sudden silence, and the missing folder from his apartment." Eyes widened, Mornay especially. That hadn't been public knowledge. "You're digging deeply," he said. "Better than digging graves," I muttered. Wolfe raised his voice just slightly. "You will not speak to one another outside of this room regarding what is said here today. If you do, I will know, and I will act accordingly." That last sentence carried more threat than a subpoena. He folded his hands. "We begin with you, Miss Lang, your association with Mr. Delham, your knowledge of the amended clause, and your warning." Lang blinked. She hadn't expected to be first, but that was Wolfe's strategy. Keep them off balance. Draw them out. One by one the noose would tighten, and somewhere in that room sat the person who had walked into Wolfe's kitchen, uninvited, unwise. Greta Lang didn't hesitate long. She adjusted the cuff of her blouse, set her folio on her lap, and turned to face Wolfe with the cautious defiance of someone used to lectures, but not from men with orchids. "Martin and I worked together directly for about 4 weeks, she began. His assignment was to review and confirm final language in the joint liability and fiduciary clauses between Mornay's firm and Prescott's portfolio entities. "Your warning," Wolfe said. "What form did it take?" I told him plainly that some elements in the fifth draft left room for interpretation that would legally compromise his neutrality. "Such as?" I prompted. "An indemnity clause was shifted forward and reworded. It shifted potential blame for losses onto the witnesses in the event of internal knowledge or collusion being proven after the fact. In other words, if he signed and something went wrong, he could be dragged in." Wolfe opened his eyes. And who authored this redraft? Greta's eyes flicked to Maddox. The legal team. But the document came from Mr. Maddox's office. Maddox didn't flinch. He sat very still, his gaze fixed on Greta, as if he were recording her tone for later legal retaliation. That clause, he said smoothly, was inserted under instruction. I don't write law, I refine language. To make it legally ambiguous, Greta said. To make it binding, Maddox snapped. Enough, Wolfe said, his voice still calm but edged. You will have your turn, Mr. Maddox. Miss Lang, did Mr. Delham appear to comprehend the implications of the changes? Only after we spoke privately. At that point he told me he was having second thoughts. He said he'd raised the concern with Mornay and was met with encouragement. Mornay lifted his brows. Encouragement. He said you told him it was nothing that would ever come back on him, Greta said, and that if he delayed, it might be interpreted as bad faith. I never threatened him, Mornay said, turning toward Wolfe. Yes, I encouraged him to follow through. He had already committed. But I never threatened him. You pressured him, Wolfe said. I made the stakes clear. The Prescott deal is a carefully balanced structure. If one leg goes soft, the whole thing collapses. Interesting metaphor, Wolfe murmured. I was watching Ralston, who was beginning to look like he'd rather be anywhere else, possibly in a full-body cast at Mount Sinai. Chet, I said, you were the last person to have lunch with Delham. What did he say about the clause? He didn't mention the clause, Ralston said, nervously adjusting his glasses. He mentioned being watched. Wolfe's head turned slowly. Watched? Ralston nodded. He said someone had followed him the day before. A man in a tan coat, tall, nondescript. He thought maybe he was from Mornay's security firm. No offense. Mornay spread his hands. None taken, but I don't employ freelancers with trench coats. He didn't describe the face, Ralston added. Just the feeling. Said it was enough to make him consider going off the radar. I was scribbling. That down when Fritz tapped at the office door. Wolfe gave me a nod. I rose and followed Fritz into the hallway. Call for you, Fritz said. Sol. I took it in the front room. What's up? I asked. Archie, Sol said. I just came from Martin Delham's apartment. You found him? No, but someone else did. That made me stand straighter. Last night someone broke in. No sign of forced entry. But Delham's laptop, briefcase, and a stack of hard-copy contract drafts are gone. Who found the scene? Building super. Delham's neighbor reported his door ajar around midnight. Super went up, saw the mess, and locked it back. But no police report yet. He was waiting to notify the landlord first. What else? There was a single sticky note left behind. My grip tightened. Message? One word. Stop. I hung up and returned to Wolfe's office, stepping in without knocking. Wolfe looked up. Delham's apartment was ransacked, I said. Laptop, documents, gone. One sticky note left behind just said, stop. Wolfe's eyes darkened. A signal, he said. They want him to vanish completely, and now they want us to back off. I'd say we're closer than they'd like, I muttered. Wolfe looked at the suspects, who had gone quiet as tombs. Maddox, he said. Your turn. Kindly explain your involvement in redrafting the contract. Maddox crossed one leg over the other, cool and unhurried. The clause in question was reviewed and approved by Prescott. It was added late, yes, but with the understanding that it offered a legal shield, not a dagger. If Delham misunderstood it, that's regrettable, but it's not my fault. Was the clause disclosed to the signatories before the final printing? Of course, Maddox said. Lang gave a dry laugh. No, it wasn't. The final revision wasn't distributed to Delham until hours before he was expected to sign. I emailed him the packet, Maddox replied. I have the logs. Which packet? I asked. The complete draft. Or the selective pages? Maddox hesitated. It was brief, but Wolfe caught it. You sent him a partial, Wolfe said. Clever. Legally tidy, ethically grotesque. I did what I was told, Maddox said. By whom? Wolfe asked. Maddox turned to Mornay. Him. Mornay stood, but Wolfe's voice stopped him. Sit. He did. You instructed Maddox to isolate Delham from the full context, Wolfe said. You gave him selective exposure and used the illusion of participation to leverage his compliance. Mornay looked down. That's not how I describe it. No, Wolfe said, but it's what you did. The room was quiet enough to hear the air hum through the radiator. Wolfe continued. One of you also entered my kitchen. One of you left that pen carelessly or deliberately. Mr. Goodwin, report. I stepped forward and opened my notebook. I compared the pen to a calligraphy gift set I saw in Mr. Maddox's office during my last visit. Same brand, same nib. Maddox looked up sharply. That's circumstantial. Sure, I said, but let me add this. Your briefcase, the brown leather one with brass trim. Fritz saw someone with one just like it enter through the alley gate 2 nights ago. We don't have it on camera, but we do have a neighbor's dog that went berserk at 11:45. That's when the motion light flipped on near the kitchen door. Maddox didn't respond. Wolfe leaned forward. You trespassed, he said. You feared discovery, so you returned to learn what we knew. That, Mr. Maddox, is no longer merely deceit. That is desperation. He turned to the group. And desperation is contagious. That was the moment. The pressure had shifted. One of them had reached out to frighten Delham. One of them had broken into his home, and now Wolfe's sanctuary has been breached. But no one stood. No one confessed. Wolfe didn't expect them to, yet. That will come soon. For now, the circle had closed, and the trap was beginning to tighten. You'd think, after the bomb Wolfe dropped about Maddox sneaking into the brownstone, that someone would have cracked, offered a shaky denial, spilled a half-truth, or at least asked for a glass of water. But no. The silence that followed was ironclad. The suspects sat like statues carved from ambition and self-interest. Wolfe, however, was not disturbed by silence. He used it the way a butcher uses a cleaver, deliberately, and with the full knowledge that something eventually had to give. Archie, he said, remove the pen. I stepped forward and picked it up, returning it to my inside pocket. Maddox's gaze didn't follow it. That told me 2 things. He either knew the game was up, or he was banking on the fact that Wolfe couldn't tie the pen to anything but proximity, for now. We will adjourn, Wolfe said calmly. You will all return here tomorrow at 10 o'clock sharp. You are not to speak to one another. You are not to contact Martin Delham. If you know where he is, you are not to shred, erase, or delete any document relevant to the Prescott-Mornay transaction. Mornay bristled. You're making this sound like a criminal proceeding. Wolfe glanced at him. Only the guilty fear due process. I showed them out one by one, and none of them had much to say. Maddox exited last. He paused in the foyer and turned slightly toward me. "This is ridiculous," he said. "Probably," I replied, "but you still broke in." "I didn't leave a pen." "Then maybe you should have taken one when you left. Your story might have held better." "Ink." He didn't respond. Just tugged his collar straight and stepped out into the evening. Back in the office, Wolfe was unusually still. He hadn't touched his beer, he hadn't glanced at his orchids. That meant the gears were grinding behind his eyes at full torque. "Saul," he said. "Already called," I replied. "He's tailing Maddox tonight. Told him not to get too close, just enough to see if he's meeting anyone or trying to clean something up." "Good." He finally reached for his glass but didn't drink. "They're afraid, not of prosecution yet, but of collapse. Delham was the loose thread. Now he's gone, but not dead." "You're sure?" "Yes," Wolfe said. "Maddox is a manipulator, not a killer, and Mornay is too polished for blood. If Delham were dead, the signals would be clearer, meant to frighten, not confuse. But he was removed, or removed himself, under duress." He leaned back. "Archie, tomorrow we confront. Tonight we verify. That clause, get me all 5 versions of the contract, including the ones from Greta Lang's office and Maddox's email logs. Have Saul dig if necessary. I'll need her cooperation." "Charm her." "Already tried that." Wolfe allowed a half snort. "Then persuade her with consequences." I left for Lang's place around 8. She lived in a sleek apartment on the Upper West Side, all glass and stone, and an elevator that sounded like it judged you. She opened the door in a silk blouse and a look of tired amusement. "Back again, Mr. Goodwin?" "Afraid so." "Wolfe wants the contract drafts." "Which ones?" "All of them. Every iteration you handled or reviewed. If you have annotated copies, even better." "You think I forged something?" "No," I said, stepping inside. "But someone did. And Wolfe intends to match each phrase like a fingerprint." She walked to a cabinet, opened a file drawer, and began pulling folders. "You're lucky I don't believe in shredders," she said. "You're lucky Wolfe doesn't believe in half-truths." She handed me 5 versions, each with sticky tabs on different clauses. Troy did most of the late-stage redlines. But I kept notes. "You'll see." "Thanks," I said, tucking them under my arm. "By the way, do you keep backup emails?" "In a secure drive. Send the relevant messages to Wolfe's address. He won't read them until morning, but he'll want to confirm timestamps." As I turned to go, she asked, "You think Martin's alive?" "Yes," I said, "but someone made sure he wouldn't want to be found." She didn't ask more. Back at the brownstone, Wolfe took the files with the reverence of a priest, receiving confessions. He examined the tabs, flipped through the margins, and nodded once. "The phrasing is not merely altered," he said. "It's layered. Language placed atop existing structure to mask the shift." Maddox concealed the liability clause inside subtext, and Delham, poor, timid Delham, finally noticed. "What's the move?" Wolfe's eyes narrowed. "We call the bluff. We make them think Delham is talking." I blinked. "He's not, is he?" Wolfe smiled, just barely. "No, but they don't know that." That night I drafted an email under a burner address, sent to Maddox, Mornay, and Lang. The subject line was simple: "Update from Delham." The body read, "He's ready to speak. Tomorrow." No signature, no trace, no details. Wolfe approved it with a nod. They will panic, and panic is fertile ground. The next morning came with rain. Grey, cold, insistent. It tapped at the windows like a metronome of dread. By 9:45 the office was arranged again. By 10:02 all 5 suspects had arrived, but this time something was different. They were quieter. Greta Lang looked irritated. Mornay looked over-prepared. Ralston looked ill. Maddox looked rattled. And Voss, well, Voss just looked ready. Wolfe didn't waste time. "Last night," he said, "you received a message. It indicated Mr. Delham was prepared to speak." Mornay's fingers twitched. Ralston blinked rapidly. Maddox swallowed. "None of you responded, that's wise. But your silence was not for lack of interest, it was fear." No one spoke. "I will ask once," Wolfe continued, "who attempted to erase Mr. Delham's presence from the negotiation, by isolation, by misdirection, by threat?" No answer. Wolfe looked at Maddox. "Who instructed you to modify the language knowing Delham's name was on the signature line?" Still silence. Wolfe turned to Voss. "Who asked you to dissuade him quietly without making it official?" She said nothing. Finally, Wolfe closed the contract folder in front of him. "I have already spoken to Saul Panzer this morning. He has found where Delham has been hiding. He is safe." That was a lie, but the reactions it provoked weren't. Ralston exhaled like he'd been punched. Mornay's jaw tightened, and Maddox stood up. "This is a circus," he snapped. Wolfe smiled. "No, this is judgment." The truth was still under wraps, but Wolfe was building the pyre, and someone's lies were about to burn. They didn't like being cornered, but Wolfe hadn't asked for their comfort. His office was no courtroom, yet it had the unnerving gravity of one. And when Wolfe claimed Saul had located Martin Delham, the temperature in the room dropped a full 10 degrees, emotionally if not physically. Of course, Delham hadn't been found. Not yet. But Wolfe wasn't in the habit of letting facts get in the way of a useful strategy. He had seen it before, how the anticipation of a confession often pulled more truth than the confession itself. "Mr. Maddox," Wolfe said, folding his hands over his stomach, "since you were the first to speak out of turn, perhaps you'll now do so deliberately." Maddox was still standing, his jaw tight, his hands buried deep in his pockets. "This is all posturing. You're bluffing about Delham." "I might be," Wolfe said, "but your concern suggests I'm not." Greta Lang, sitting to Maddox's left, let out a slow breath through her nose. "Are we going to talk about the real issue or just dance around insinuations?" "Oh, I intend to talk about the real issue," Wolfe replied. "But first I must dismantle the structure you've all so carefully arranged." He gestured to the pile of contracts on his desk, tabbed, marked, and annotated in a manner that only Wolfe could manage without lifting a finger. "These," he said, "are 5 versions of the merger agreement between Prescott and Mornay Holdings. 4 of them are draft revisions. 1 is the final. The most illuminating of the 5 was produced from Miss Lang's files, and it contains handwritten notes by Martin Delham himself." Voss leaned forward slightly, but said nothing. Mornay folded his arms. "In these notes," Wolfe continued, "Delham circled a specific line in the indemnity clause. It reads, and I quote, 'Should a signatory party to this transaction, including any witness to execution, possess material knowledge contrary to statements made herein, they shall be subject to investigation and potential liability.'" He paused. Now that clause was not present in the second or third drafts. It appears in the fourth and fifth with slight variations in wording, but only in the fifth does it become binding, and only the fifth was presented to Delham for signature. Maddox cleared his throat, visibly working to steady his tone. The language is protective, standard legal precaution. Protective of whom? Wolfe asked. Certainly not Delham. I was under instruction. So you said, Wolfe replied coolly. From Mornay? Mornay looked up sharply. That's an oversimplification. Then simplify it for me, Wolfe said. Did you or did you not request that Mr. Maddox shield the clause's full implications from Delham? I said the clause should be included. I did not specify its concealment. Then Mr. Maddox acted on his own initiative. No answer. You're hedging, I said, which is what you're good at when there's money on the table. But this isn't about a deal anymore. This is about whether a man vanished because you made him believe he was stepping into quicksand. Wolfe's voice resumed, measured, and cool. Martin Delham had been uneasy for days. He reached out to Miss Lang, expressed fear. He contacted Miss Voss in a state of emotional distress. He spoke to Mr. Ralston about being followed. And then, hours after being handed the final draft, he disappears. Greta leaned forward. Are you saying Mornay or Maddox? No, Wolfe said. I'm saying one of you reached out in a manner that tipped him over the edge. It might have been a note, an intrusion, a silent threat. Something so specific it caused him to abandon his apartment, his work, and his own defense. Wolfe turned his eyes on Elena Voss. Miss Voss, you are the only person in this room who knew where Delham would be at a particular hour. You had a scheduled meeting with him the morning after his final call to you. I did, she said, voice level. And you claim he never arrived? He didn't. But the building's records indicate someone accessed the office entrance shortly after 8:30 using an associate-level keycard. Delham's meeting was at 9. She blinked, just once. That could have been anyone. Yes, Wolfe said. But according to the building supervisor, the card had a minor magnetic failure that occasionally caused a delay in reading. Only one keycard matched that profile last week. He looked at her calmly. Yours. Voss didn't move. Which means, Wolfe continued, either you went to the office early, as you say, and waited in vain, or you went to intercept Delham before he arrived. Intercept, she repeated. You were the only person who might have convinced him to stay silent without appearing overtly threatening. He trusted you. That is your talent, Miss Voss. Strategic comfort, legal mercy. Voss looked down at her hands. I didn't force him. No, Wolfe said, you didn't. But you suggested, didn't you, that withdrawing from the agreement would protect him, that if he vanished for a while, the liability would wash away with time. I wanted to keep him safe. So you advised him to disappear? I advised him not to sign. Wolfe nodded slowly. And did you tell anyone about that advice? Voss hesitated. No, not even Mr. Mornay. I knew he wouldn't like it. Yet someone followed Delham. Someone left. A note. Someone entered my house. Someone escalated. So, Miss Voss, if you were the first to know Martin was pulling out, how long before that information reached those with less noble intentions? She didn't respond. Her silence spoke more clearly than her words. Wolfe looked to Mornay. You claim business, not betrayal, but someone in your network acted beyond your instructions. I didn't send Maddox to manipulate him. Mornay said. He knew what was at stake, but I never ordered anyone to follow or threaten Delham. And yet, Wolfe said, someone did. He turned to Maddox. You maintain you were following orders, but you also trespassed. You wanted to know if Wolfe was close. You returned here to gauge the pressure. Maddox's composure fractured, if only slightly. I panicked. There it is, I said. Wolfe nodded. And panic spreads. One of you whispered doubt into Delham's ear. Another pushed fear through his door. A third sent a legal dagger dressed as a paragraph, and someone, perhaps one of you, perhaps not, crossed a line Delham couldn't bear. Greta asked, So where is he? Wolfe didn't answer right away. He let the question hang just long enough for everyone to picture the answer they feared most. Then he said, I believe he is waiting, watching, trying to decide if it's safe to speak, whether we can offer protection. He turned to me. Archie, call Saul. I already had the phone in my hand. And tell him, Wolfe said, the net has drawn tight. Now we let them sweat. No one moved. Not one of them rose from their chair. Wolfe had turned the brownstone into a crucible, and the truth was finally starting to boil. I made the call from the front room while Wolfe remained in the office with the suspects, who were now sitting stiffly in silence, like schoolchildren sentenced to reflect. The kind of silence that tastes sour in the mouth, part guilt, part calculation. Saul, I said when he picked up on the first ring. The bluff worked. They're cracking. It's time to close in. I thought you were already squeezing, Saul replied. We are. But now we make them believe the squeeze is coming from somewhere else. There was a pause. I could hear the scratch of Saul's pen on paper. What do you want me to do? Go back to the building where Delham lived. Talk to the neighbor again. The one who heard the door creak open the night the apartment got tossed. Recheck the hall cams, even if they were supposedly off. Then I want you to stop by Lang's office and confirm her assistant's schedule. Something smells off about the timeline she gave us. I'll have something by this evening. Thanks. I hung up, stepped back into the office, and nodded at Wolfe. He acknowledged it with a slight movement of his head, and then stood, not fully, just enough to push himself forward in his chair and loom. Ladies and gentlemen, he said, we are nearing the end. I slid back into my seat to his right. You have all, to varying degrees, participated in the erosion of a man's certainty. Some by omission, some by implication, and one or two, no doubt, with specific intent. That erosion, I believe, led to his retreat, but not to his destruction. He paused and looked directly at Mornay. Delham will speak. Mornay said nothing. You fear exposure, Wolfe continued. Each of you. Because the contracts you've shaped are not merely instruments of finance, they are tools of pressure. And someone, either in this room or acting on behalf of someone in this room, used that pressure to silence a man who hesitated. Greta crossed her arms. You keep saying someone, Hewitt, why not name them? Because until now, Wolfe said, I had not fully decided. He picked up the top contract from the stack on his desk. This, he said, was the version given to Delham 24 hours before he disappeared. It bears 3 fingerprints. Delham's, Maddox's, and one unknown. Not yours, Mr. Mornay, not Miss Lang's, not Miss Voss's, not Ralston's. He turned his eyes to Maddox. Yours, Mr. Maddox. And one more. Maddox's expression held steady, but I could see the crack forming behind his eyes. You knew he had doubts. You knew he might speak to someone, Lang, Voss, even the media. So you escalated. You have no proof, Maddox said. Pfui, Wolfe snapped, with more disdain than I'd heard from him in weeks. I have something better. I have motive, opportunity, and behavior consistent with desperation. He jabbed a finger at the pen sitting once more on the corner of his desk. You returned to this house. You risked exposure. Why? Because you believed Delham had already spoken to me, that his message was waiting, that I might have found the hole you dug into the contract. Wolfe let that settle before turning again to the group. And yet, you were not alone in your deceit. So too, he shifted his attention toward Voss. You withheld the voicemail's full contents. When I asked about it initially, you played a partial recording, but Fritz later overheard you replaying the message in full while standing by the kitchen hallway. That extended version included the phrase, "She told me to disappear." Said it was the only way. Elena's eyes didn't flicker, but her breath caught. Miss Voss, Wolfe said, you didn't instruct him to run, but you offered the idea. You wrapped it in concern, told him to lay low until the storm passed. I didn't think it would cause this, she murmured. You did what you thought would protect him, Wolfe said. But you became complicit in his absence, and in that absence someone else found an opportunity. He shifted to Greta. Miss Lang, your role was advisory, but your meeting with Delham the day before his disappearance wasn't merely social. You confirmed for him that the contract's liability language could be interpreted as legal exposure. She nodded once, curtly. He deserved to know. Indeed, but in telling him you reinforced his fear. You pushed the weight further. Now Wolfe turned to Ralston, who had all but shrunk into his suit. Mr. Ralston, you have said very little, but you knew about the clause before Delham told you. You didn't tell him that. Instead, you let him spiral. Ralston opened his mouth, then shut it. I didn't think it was serious, he mumbled. Wolfe shook his head. Negligence is not innocence. Mornay stirred, looking up. So what now? You've named all of us. Who's to blame? Wolfe looked directly at him. You. Mornay blinked. You instructed Maddox to press the clause. You pressured Delham to sign. You ignored his questions and downplayed his concerns. And when he resisted, you asked Voss to calm him down. Your words. That was the lever that dislodged him. You can't prove... No, Wolfe said. I don't need to. Because he will. The room froze. Martin Delham has been located, Wolfe lied smoothly. He has agreed to speak to the district attorney. He has given his full account, including documents. Greta sat straighter. Ralston looked ill. Maddox swore under his breath. Voss said nothing. Mornay stared at Wolfe. I want to speak with him. You will, Wolfe said, in the presence of legal counsel and law enforcement. He rang the bell. Fritz appeared. Show our guests out, Wolfe said. We are finished for today. One by one they left, quieter now, less certain, like chess pieces being removed from the board after a long game. Once the door shut behind them, Wolfe leaned back and closed his eyes. That, he said, was necessary. You really think Delham's going to show? He will, Wolfe said. Fear makes a man vanish, but truth, once prepared, makes him brave. And if he doesn't, Then we make do. We've rattled the tree. The fruit will fall. He opened his eyes. Call Inspector Kramer. What should I tell him? Tell him to bring a warrant. Maddox's name. Possibly Mornay's. I will compose the statement tonight. Wolfe stood slowly, rare for him, and crossed to his orchid shelves, the steam warming his face. Some crimes, he said softly, are not committed with violence, but with suggestion, omission, and pressure. He turned to me. But justice, he added, can be just as quiet. I nodded, pulled out my notebook, and began preparing my final log. Because now, finally, we were near the end, and Martin Delham, wherever he was, had a choice, to stay hidden or step forward and let Wolfe's final move play out. When the call came, it was just past 7 in the evening, and Wolfe was in the plant room tending to his orchids with the reverence of a man curating his own sanctuary. I was in the office going over the day's notes and wondering if Delham really would show up, or if we'd just executed the most articulate bluff in West 35th Street history. The phone rang once, twice. I answered. "It's Saul," came the voice, calm and direct. "He's here." Delham? In the flesh, shaken, tired, but coherent. He turned up at a friend's brownstone in Yonkers, of all places. Friend called him out for looking like he'd seen a ghost. Eventually coaxed the truth out. Then Delham asked him to get in touch with me. Said he'd only talked to someone Wolfe approved. I gave Wolfe the signal through the glass. He nodded and came in, wiping his hands on a soft cloth. "Tell Saul," Wolfe said, "to bring Mr. Delham here. Now, we'll keep the house still and the tea warm." I relayed the instructions. 37 minutes later, Martin Delham stepped across the threshold of the brownstone. He was thinner than the photograph Greta had shown me, his face hollowed by sleeplessness and the kind of anxiety that eats at the soft tissue of a man's confidence. He wore the same grey overcoat he'd left his apartment in, and his briefcase, once neatly packed, looked like it had been dragged through someone's idea of secrecy. "Mr. Delham," Wolfe said, not rising but nodding respectfully. "Please sit." Delham settled into the red chair like it might reject him. "I didn't mean for this to go so far," he said, voice cracking with the weight of guilt. "That's not uncommon," Wolfe replied. "But it is now irrelevant. What matters is what you saw, what you understood, and what you were made to believe." Delham exhaled. "I thought I was being framed." "You were being positioned," Wolfe said. A subtle but meaningful distinction. I poured him a glass of water. He drank half before speaking again. "I noticed the clause change about 3 days before I disappeared. It didn't match the earlier versions. Maddox told me it was just clean-up, language smoothing, but something about it didn't sit right." "Because it exposed you," Wolfe said. Delham nodded. "I reached out to Elena Voss first. She was the only person who ever spoke to me like a human being in that place. She told me to stall to get clarification. She also told you," Wolfe added, "that disappearing might be your safest option." Delham hesitated. "She didn't use those words, but I got the message. And then I went to Greta Lang. She confirmed what I feared. Said the clause could be used to drag me into liability proceedings if the deal fell apart. She didn't say it maliciously. She wanted me to know." "And did you tell anyone else?" Delham shook his head. "Only Chet Ralston. I met him for lunch. I needed someone to tell me I was imagining things. Instead," I said, "he gave you silence." Yes, he didn't confirm, he didn't deny, just said to stay quiet and do what I was told. That's when you panicked. I started seeing someone following me. I couldn't prove it, but it felt wrong. Then the folder disappeared from my apartment. A note was left. One word. Stop. That's when I packed and left. I took the train to Yonkers, stayed off the grid, used burner phones to check headlines. I was waiting to see if the storm would pass. You became the storm, Wolfe said, not unkindly. Delham looked up. Did I cause this? No, Wolfe said. They did. You were simply the line they were all willing to cross. He turned to me. Archie. I opened the side drawer and pulled out the annotated contract Delham had marked before his vanishing act. I handed it to him. Delham flipped through it, then stopped on the page with the liability clause. My notes, he said. You kept them? Of course. This version, it's not the one Maddox gave me. No, Wolfe said. It's the one he submitted to Prescott for record, the one with your notes removed. You were meant to disappear, not just physically, but from the paper trail. Delham swallowed hard. So, it was him? In part, Wolfe said. But Maddox acted under pressure. Mornay orchestrated, Lang warned, Voss advised, Ralston withheld. The crime was not a single blow. It was many fingers pressing in the same place until the structure collapsed. Delham sat very still, then, quietly. I want to testify. You will, Wolfe said. An hour later, after Fritz had brought tea and Saul had escorted Delham into a guest room to rest, Wolfe rang Inspector Kramer. Kramer didn't like being summoned to the brownstone after dark. But when he arrived, trenchcoat wet from the street, and eyes carrying their usual blend of suspicion and fatigue, Wolfe handed him a file with the efficiency of a man turning over an antique for appraisal. These are the annotated drafts. This is the sworn statement. Mr. Delham will give it in person in the morning. I recommend charges of coercion, document manipulation, and criminal conspiracy, possibly unlawful surveillance. Kramer flipped through the top pages and frowned. You really think Mornay was behind this? No, Wolfe said, I know he was. And Maddox? He will roll the moment you ask. What about the others? They'll scramble, Wolfe said. Lang will lawyer up. Voss will try to bury her involvement beneath advocacy. Ralston will say nothing, as always. And you? Kramer asked, almost as an afterthought. I will return to my orchids. Kramer gave a tight smile. Of course you will. He left without ceremony. I stayed a moment longer, watching. Wolfe eased himself back into the wide leather chair, its arms worn smooth from decades of deduction. You okay with how this ended? I asked. No one is dead, he said. That is something. And a man has found his voice. That is more. Even though he vanished first? Even though, Wolfe said. Sometimes retreat is not cowardice. It is the gathering of courage. He picked up his book on tropical orchids and opened it with a sigh. Fritz came in quietly and placed a bowl of poached pears on the tray beside him. Outside, the rain had stopped. Inside, the brownstone was quiet again. Dinner was served. Justice had been portioned. And in the calm that followed, Wolfe gave a final murmur without looking up. Liars thrive in noise, Archie. But truth, it returns in silence. I nodded, closed my notebook, and turned out the light. Case closed. The morning after the storm, broke. The brownstone was silent in the way that only victory can allow, a deep, composed silence as though the walls themselves were absorbing the last echoes of confrontation. Fritz was in the kitchen preparing breakfast, humming a quiet tune that sounded suspiciously like Schubert, and Wolfe was doing what Wolfe always did after a case resolved itself, absolutely nothing. He sat in his chair in the office, robe wrapped around his stomach like a robe should be, slippers soft against the carpet, sipping beer from a chilled glass and eyeing the orchid catalogue in his lap as though each bloom had something new to confess. Me? I was at my desk updating my notes. It's a ritual, organizing the chaos Wolfe unravels into something neat enough for legal record and occasionally for posterity. Not that Wolfe would ever allow me to publish a full account, but a man can dream. Martin Dellum had slept the night in the guest room without incident. Fritz had left a tray with toast, orange marmalade, and fresh tea. When I peeked in around 8, he was sitting cross-legged in one of Fritz's overstarched robes, writing something in a notepad like it might save his life. It probably would. By 9, Saul had picked him up, escorted him to the district attorney's office, and handed him off with all the ceremony of a man delivering an original Rembrandt. Kramer had been waiting. So had 2 ADA investigators and one very serious-looking young man with horn-rimmed glasses and a folder thicker than a mortgage agreement. Wolfe hadn't gone, of course, nor had he planned to. His work, as he saw it, ended at revelation. The justice part was up to the city. At 10:30, Kramer called. "He's talking," Kramer said. "Got him in a room, counsel present. Says he's got drafts, handwritten notes, metadata on a thumb drive, and backup emails. Names everyone, even Voss. You were right. She didn't scare him, but she gave him the idea to vanish. And Maddox, well, he's already blinking." "He'll blink more when the cuffs close," I said. "Yeah, we've got a quiet team tailing Mornay just in case. No press yet. Internal Ethics Board has been notified. Feds may pick it up. Financial Crimes Division is licking their chops." "And Wolfe?" Kramer asked, grudging respect in his tone. "Sitting with orchids," I said. "Victorious, immobile." "Of course." He hung up. I returned to the office and gave Wolfe the highlights. "Good," he said without looking up. "Justice should be swift when the facts are clear, and occasionally it should be educational. Think they'll all face charges? Maddox will. Mornay may find a clever lawyer, but the damage is done. Lang will retreat into corporate limbo. Ralston will go back to being forgotten. Miss Voss, she will be spared public consequence, but not private reckoning." "And Dellum?" "He may yet surprise you," Wolfe said, setting down the catalogue. "If he remains steady through testimony, he may even rediscover his footing." "You sound almost optimistic." "No," Wolfe said. "Only pragmatic. Fear unmakes men, but it can also remake them." There was a pause while Fritz came in and cleared Wolfe's glass, replacing it with a fresh one. The kitchen door swung shut behind him like punctuation. "You know," I said, "this one wasn't like the others." "How so?" "There was no murder, no body, just pressure. Just a man cracking under it and others pretending not to notice." Wolfe nodded, slowly. "It is a more modern form of villainy, but no less consequential. The soul does not need to be extinguished for justice to be required. It only needs to be cornered." I leaned back in my chair. "You ever think about how close we came to losing him?" "I think about how easily we might have," Wolfe said, "and how Rarely people choose to return once they've disappeared. He reached into the drawer beside him and pulled out the pen, the same one Maddox had left behind in Wolfe's kitchen. It was clean now, polished and gleaming under the lamp. "Will you keep it?" I asked. "No," he said, "but I shall. Retain it until the trial concludes. Then I will send it to Maddox in prison. He will need something with which to write his appeal." I chuckled. "You're getting sentimental." "Archie," he replied, "I am vindictive, not sentimental. We let that one hang in the air. A little after noon the mail arrived. Nothing dramatic, just a few envelopes, a quarterly from the Orchid Society, and a handwritten letter. I opened it while Wolfe pretended not to notice. It was from Martin Delham. In neat cursive, he thanked Wolfe for the quiet strength of your conviction and for creating a space where the truth did not need to shout. He promised to testify, to rebuild, and, should he ever regain his professional standing, to work only with people who believed integrity wasn't just a word you printed on the last page of a contract. Wolfe read the letter twice, then folded it with precision and placed it in the upper right drawer of his desk, beside the corkscrew and the dictionary he rarely used. "That," he said, "is sufficient." By evening the brownstone had returned to its natural rhythm. Fritz was preparing lamb in rosemary glaze. Wolfe had resumed his reading. And I took a walk down to 9th Avenue, let the evening traffic blur by, and allowed myself the rare indulgence of thinking about the kind of victory that doesn't get headlines. No one would write about Delham's testimony. There wouldn't be a dramatic photo on the courthouse steps, but somewhere between ethics and fear, a man had chosen to come back, and Wolfe, as always, had seen it first. When I returned, Wolfe was still in his chair. The room smelled faintly of thyme and ink. He looked up once, only long enough to say, "Archie, bring the sherry." I did, and as I poured it I realized this case, like so many before it, hadn't been about law or money. It had been about the pressure people endure and the choices they make under its weight. And Wolfe, immovable as always, had simply sat, listened and waited, until the truth, unable to bear the silence any longer, walked through his door. 2 days after Martin Delham's reappearance and quiet declaration of truth, the city moved. On it always does. Mornay's name was whispered in certain downtown lounges, with the sort of hush once reserved for men who overplayed their hands. Maddox had been formally charged, coercion, evidence tampering and unlawful entry among the list, and was last seen being led into a courthouse with the body language of a man preparing to lose everything but his cufflinks. Lang issued a public statement denying all wrongdoing. Ralston declined to comment. Voss retained counsel and disappeared from sight, which in her case was a form of damage control more than guilt. And Wolfe? Wolfe took a full day off. He didn't call it that, of course. But after the sherry and the lamb and his final conversation with Delham, who'd returned briefly to say a proper thank you in person, Wolfe declared the following morning one of strategic rest. I was told to hold all calls, decline all visits and refrain from uttering the word contract until Monday. He sat in the plant room that day for nearly 5 hours straight. No dictation, no radio, no complaints. Just orchids and thought and, possibly, a little reflection, though I wouldn't dare suggest that aloud. When I finally returned to my desk with a fresh cup of coffee and a pile of unread mail, I found something peculiar waiting for me on top of the stack. A small envelope. No return address. Handwritten in familiar but cautious script. I opened it. Inside was a single note. Archie. He told me everything. I knew, somewhere deep down, but I let it happen anyway. You and Wolfe. You were right to press, even if I hated you for it. E.V. No flourish, no apology, just those few lines. I handed it to Wolfe that evening without a word. He read it once, then tucked it beneath the coaster under his glass. I wondered when remorse would arrive, he said. It always runs late. Think she'll come forward? No, Wolfe replied, but she won't sleep soundly for a while. That will suffice. He poured another inch of beer. I returned to my desk, and that might have been the end of it, had it not been for the phone call. It came just past 6 on Saturday evening. Fritz had cleared the table. Wolfe had declared the roast acceptable. I was considering a walk. The phone rang twice. I picked it up. Goodwin, I said. The voice was calm, low, and unmistakably controlled. Archie, it's Greta Lang. I paused. To what do I owe the pleasure? I won't keep you long. I just wanted to let you know I've left the Prescott group. Voluntarily. More or less, she said. Let's call it mutually strategic. I'll bet. I also wanted to say something I didn't have the chance to say before. What's that? That I knew Maddox was crossing a line. I didn't know how far, but I suspected, and I stayed silent because I wanted to believe it would resolve itself, that Delham would either give in or disappear, and we could all claim it was his decision. That's not how it works. I know that now, and for what it's worth, I admire what Wolfe did, the way he cornered us. It was brutal, but clean. I'll pass that along. No need, he already knows. And she hung up. I relayed the call to Wolfe later, after dessert. He nodded but didn't comment. That evening I took out the file labelled Delham and made the final entries. I listed the case under strategic coercion rather than the usual missing persons. There was no murder weapon, no body, no ransom, just pressure and decisions and a small, steady unraveling of the kind of people who wear fine suits and speak with calculated precision. And Wolfe? He'd seen it all coming from the first moment. Monet walked through our door with his varnished smile and envelope of bad intentions. I sometimes wonder how many cases Wolfe solves before I even know there's a case. He never says, but the more time I spend watching him work, the more I realize his victories aren't built on surprise. They're built on pattern, on human behavior, routine, habit. The lies people cling to, the truths they try to outmaneuver, and the moments when pressure, subtle, invisible, persistent, makes them choose between fear and integrity. Delham had chosen integrity. Late, yes, imperfectly, but he had chosen it. And that, in Wolfe's book, made him the rarest of subjects. That Sunday, just after breakfast, Wolfe made a quiet request. Archie, he said, call Theodore down. I want him to examine the Paphiopedilum hybrid. It bloomed overnight. You want him to repot it? No, I want him to admire it. Which was Wolfe's version of celebration? I called Theodore, poured a second coffee, and leaned against the doorway of the plant room while Wolfe pointed at the bloom with something bordering on pride. I take it the case is truly closed, I said. Wolfe gave a small nod. The man has testified. The guilty have been named, and justice, though imperfect, is now engaged. He glanced back at the orchid. It is enough. I let that settle for a beat. Still thinking about Mornay? No, Wolfe said. He was predictable. But the others, Lang, Vost, Delham, they will change. They have to, or they will vanish in other ways. Change is rare, but not impossible, Wolfe said. Even orchids must adapt. Later that afternoon, I stepped out for a stroll. The breeze carried the early signs of spring, and the city, for all its noise and motion, felt briefly aligned. I passed 3 newspapers on my way to the corner stand. None of them carried anything about the Prescott fallout. That was the nature of our work. No screaming headlines, no ribbon-cutting ceremonies, just silence restored, pressure relieved, and a chair in a brownstone that never once needed to move for justice to find its footing. When I returned, Wolfe was reading. Dinner was being prepared. The pen, Maddox's, had been boxed and addressed to a federal detention center. Wolfe hadn't said he'd send it, but I recognized the handwriting on the label. "Do you believe he'll use it?" I asked. Wolfe didn't glance up. "To appeal?" "No," he said, "to write his memoir." And with that, the case was done. Not with a bang, but with the quiet satisfaction of a mind once again proven immovable.